Welcome back to today's video. Today is Friday, May 24th, 2024, and today we're going to be taking a look at the 2024 election based on the 2022 errors from the midterm cycle, the polling errors of a very interesting midterm election year where Democrats were expecting one thing, Republicans were expecting the same thing, and yet it ultimately just did not happen. In a number of key and crucial battleground states, governor races, Senate races, House races, we ultimately found that the Democratic Party saw a consistent overperformance across a number of states, and so it serves as a break-in precedent from the 2020, even 2016 election cycle, where the polls seem to have always underestimated Republicans in some battleground states. And so for 2022 to come around, a lot of you guys have been asking, there's a lot of narrative on things like 538, ABC News, Washington Post, New York Times, about 2020 polling errors, 2016 polling errors. And I get it. A presidential election, of course, is always going to be much more comparative to a presidential election like 2024 than a midterm election. But humor me for the sake of this video, because I think there's certainly some reasons to trust some of the data from 2022, given that the inaccuracies of it are more recent than the 2016 or 2020 presidential election. Polling methodology in a post-COVID era is very much similar to what we saw in 2022 than what we saw in 2020 when people were being polled from their homes and there wasn't any type of actual on-the-ground polls, even exit polling data that was done that was a bit more skewed than what we'd usually normally expect on election night. So this cycle, this time around, I want to take a look at some interesting 2022-2024 comparisons to see, just genuinely speaking, what do the polling errors from 2022 tell us about the outcome of this election? And if we see something similar, what might it look like on the presidential level? And so we'll start out by characterizing all of the states that we're not going to be looking at in terms of polls. Although there were polls done in states like New York because they had a competitive governor's race, I don't want to spend too much time looking at them because I don't think that they would actually tell us much about the state of the race in an individual state. Though it might have been competitive, they might have received 3 or 4 polls throughout the entire election cycle. We often find that polls that are done in states that really don't get polled too often is that there isn't the infrastructure in place to actually poll these states correctly. For instance, states like Maryland saw in the Democratic primary, despite the momentum that we saw Angela Alsobrooks winning in the Senate primary, a lot of it happened in the final 2 weeks of the campaign that wasn't accurately reflected by polls. We've also seen polls that were done months out in advance that end up skewing themselves into the average because there aren't many polls done. For instance, in states like Oklahoma, where there was, in theory, a competitive governor's race, there were maybe just a handful of polls done throughout the entire election cycle, and some showed it far more competitive than it actually was because this state is not routinely polled and doesn't have the infrastructure in place to ensure that these polls are more accurate and a historical track record for these polling companies to really do their baseline models on. And so what we're doing here, again, is characterizing all of the states and the districts that we know are going to go a certain way. For, better or for worse also, to some of them just simply don't have extensive polling done in them. And I think that's because we aren't in the full swing of the general election season. And so, for instance, in states like Colorado and New Mexico and Virginia and Minnesota, arguably speaking, but we'll talk about that in a moment, there isn't as much polls, isn't as many polls done in these states. And I think that's a problem because it really goes to show that there is not as much investment into some of these non-battleground states. But of course, politics is a money game in many cases. And so a lot of these polling companies really don't want to spend their time focusing on states that they know are not going to go the way that they ultimately want. And so we're going to go ahead and characterize all of the remaining states on your screen right now. We have Texas up. We have Florida we're not going to characterize. The polls were pretty much spot on in 2022, and I don't think it really necessitates really an intense conversation about it. I also think, too, Ohio and Texas, we're really just going to get out right now. North Carolina, it's interesting. We're not going to pull it because we don't have any statewide polls from the state except for the 2022 Senate race. We do find, though, that I think it doesn't really shift much from what we actually see. It still ends up being a likely red state, so we're going to keep that there. Unfortunately, though, I will say the polls done in North Carolina weren't super extensive. Despite it being a traditionally competitive state, it actually wasn't the focus of the 2022 election cycle, and so we didn't see that many Senate polls out of the state. Ultimately, though, they did say Ted Budd would win the state by roughly 6-7 points. He ended up winning by roughly 3. And so it really just depends on what you're looking at, what state you're looking at, when you're looking at it, and the accuracy of these polls. For the rest of them, we do find some interesting results. So we'll start off by characterizing Texas first. I think that's just going to be an interesting state. It isn't really that competitive this upcoming cycle. I think right now Republicans, Donald Trump, Ted Cruz are on track to win the state, but it would just be interesting to see, what were the polls expecting versus what did they actually show. Now, if you know anything about 2022 governor race in Texas, you'll know that Beto O'Rourke ran for this race. The RCB average had the Republicans up by roughly 10.4. It ended up being 10.9. And so the polls here were actually quite accurate. A state where they weren't super accurate, and actually in a way that I don't think Democrats would be super, super pleased by, but it's in the state of Ohio, when we saw that Tim Ryan in the average on Real Clear Politics was winning across the, not winning across the state, sorry. The average here had showed that we saw J.D. Vance ahead by roughly 8 points. He ended up winning by 6.5. And so it was a slight reduction in support, but ultimately, given the polls we're seeing today, not much is going to change. I want to also characterize some of the easier states that we can use. For instance, the state of Minnesota. We can start off with that one right now. Shows, or actually in 2022, I need to pull up the numbers because for some reason it just simply isn't there. They didn't have a Senate race that was, at all a point of interest because it just wasn't there. It wasn't one of those states that was up in the election cycle. And so we're really basing it off the governor map. Minnesota's not really a competitive state. It's not, at least should not be targeted too heavily by Republicans this cycle. Back then it said Tim Walz would win by 4.3. Ended up winning by roughly 7 points, 7.7%. So actually that's enough to bump Minnesota up to the likely Democratic column based on the polls we're looking at. And so here you actually have the final states we're looking at for the election cycle: Georgia, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, New Hampshire, Arizona, Nevada. And so we're starting off in alphabetical order. It's just how the way the thing works. We're going to look at Arizona, look at the polls from 2022, see if the swing is enough on average between the Senate and governor race there to actually push either direction, left or right. And so we'll start off by looking at the Trump versus Biden polls right now. They say that Donald Trump is ahead by roughly 4 points across the state. It is quite interesting if you're looking at it from the outside lens too, because Arizona is a state that has been rapidly changing in favor of the Democratic Party, but seems to be reverting back to where it was in 2016. It also is at the exact opposite point from where it was in 2020. Biden was up by 4. Trump is now up by 4. And so I find it to be quite interesting. So I think it's definitely something to take a look at and definitely deserves further exploration. And I promise you we will get to that later on in the election cycle. So Arizona, Trump versus Biden. Trump is up by 4 right now. Where was it in 2022? Well, in the Senate race, they said Blake Masters would win by 0.3. Mark Kelly ended up winning by 4.9. And so that is on average a 5.2% swing in favor of the Democrats. And honestly, I think it is quite interesting to see how much the state has actually changed in the leftward direction. The governor's race there also saw a very similar shift. Katie Hobbs won by 0.6. Carrie Lake was supposed to win by 3.5. And so that right there is a 4.1% victory. And so on average here, you found that the swing average 4.7% left wing. Where does that put Arizona? In the Democratic column by a larger margin than where it was in 2022 and 2020's presidential election. Now let's move over to the state of Georgia, a state where Donald Trump leads Joe Biden by roughly 4 points across the state. Now here's the thing. The polls in Georgia in 2020 were actually very interesting. I think you would have found that, they saw Biden winning by roughly the same exact amount that he ended up winning by. The polls in the runoff election were also very uniquely accurate. And so Georgia hasn't always been this state that has been too far off. Well, when you take a look at the Senate race here, they said that Raphael Warnock would lose to Herschel Walker by 1.4. The swing here, 1.4% to 0.9%, you're talking about, if I do the math on that correctly, 2.3%. And so that isn't super significant. It isn't significant enough for me to say, for instance, that Democrats were all of a sudden going to win on the presidential, because that's not how the average swing works. When you look at the swing on the governor's race too, they said Kemp would win by 8.3. He ended up winning by roughly 8. The swing is just simply not enough, and so Georgia is still a lean Republican state. Moving over to the next state. After Georgia, we have the state of New Hampshire, where in 2022, and I can show you the polls here in 2024, I don't know why it's not pulled up, Trump is currently losing to Biden by 5.3. Well, when you take a look at the 2022 election results, Maggie Hassan was supposed to win by 1.4. She ended up winning by 9.1. And so that was a 7.7% swing here. If you add that to President Biden's numbers, that puts him 3 points above 10, so 13, but 5 points above where they were back in 2020 in the presidential. So New Hampshire becomes likely blue. Moving on to the next state, the state of Nevada. A very interesting one if you ask me, but Trump currently leads by 5.3. I find this to be interesting because it is the state that Republicans almost always think they're going to win, but just simply end up coming up short. They believed it in 22, in 2020, in 18, in 2016, in 2014, and in 2012, and in 2010. And yet in almost every competitive election, with the exception of the most recent governor's race, Nevada has been blue, even if the polls in the majority of the competitive elections, again, predicted a Republican victory. So Trump is up by 5. Well, where were we back in 2022? The polls actually weren't too far off. They did overestimate Republicans for sure. In the governor's race by 1.3%, and in the Senate race by even larger than that. You saw that they overestimated Republicans by roughly 4.3%. That's significant. But on average here, when you combine that with the factor that it was off by roughly 1.3, you'll see that when you divide that by 2, you end up with an average of 2.8. I'm doing the math here on my iPhone calculator because I can't do it mentally that quickly. Trump would move out of the likely column, but still end up flipping the state. And so, despite Arizona going blue, and despite Georgia being in a way closer, Nevada ends up red, 3 points to the right. That puts Donald Trump at 257, Joe Biden at 237. Let's move on to the states that are going to make or break this election. Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. Very key, very crucial battleground states, ones that Democrats are going to be investing in tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars in, and so will Republicans. In 2022, they did the same thing. Right now in the national numbers, Trump leads, or the statewide numbers, Trump leads Pennsylvania by 2.3%. Trump has led in every single poll recently, with the exception of Fox News, which shows a tie, and this has seen a significant trend away from where it was from President Biden just a month ago, being up by less than half a point. But 2022 might tell us an interesting story. On the governor's race, we saw that Shapiro was supposed to win by 8.3%. He ended up winning by 14.8%. That's a 6.5% shift. When you take a look at the Senate race here, you find that John Fetterman ended up winning by 4.9%. The polls said Dr. Oz would win by 0.3%. And so that there is a shift of 5.3%. On average, 5.9%. These numbers here don't check out for President Trump. In fact, they reduce the margin of victory not only to 0, but move it over into the Biden column by a very substantial amount, 3.6%. Nearly triple, in fact, actually, exactly triple what it was in 2020. Pennsylvania goes lean blue. Let's move on to the next state of Wisconsin, where we see in the presidential race, if we can get to it, Wisconsin right here, Trump is leading by 0.1%. And that's never a good sign, because any swing to the left means an automatic Democratic victory. So let's take a look. In the governor's race, Tim Michels, the Republican, was supposed to win by 0.6. We actually found that Tony Evers, the incumbent Democrat, won by 3.3. So a 4-point shift, 3.9% if we're being technical. In the Senate race, Ron Johnson was supposed to win by 3.6 and ended up winning by roughly 1 point. That is a 2.6% shift to the left. Divide that by 2, an average shift of 3.25%, which would be, again, over triple what it was in 2020 for President Biden. That brings Wisconsin easily into the lean Democratic column. And so now it all comes down to Michigan, a state where President Biden has seen recent troubles in winning over the electorate here and winning over his key constituents amongst Arab American communities and Black American communities. Detroit, Dearborn, very crucial portions of the state's electorate, very crucial portions, at least of the Democratic Party's electorate. Right now, Michigan stands to be a toss-up. And based on the national numbers, we see that head-to-head against President Biden, Donald Trump leads him by 1.1% in this state. But let's take a look. There wasn't a Senate race here, but there was a governor's race. A governor's race where Gretchen Whitmer was supposed to win by 1 point. She ended up winning by 10.6, a 9.6% shift. So when compared to the Trump 1.1% advantage, this becomes a state that Biden wins by 8.5%. And with it, the presidency. This brings us down 281 to 257. A very, very interesting election where if 2022 ended up panning out correctly, we actually would see Biden winning another 4-year term. 281 to 257. And Democrats point to this as a point of where they see the polls going in their direction. They point out that in 2022, despite all this national narrative that is eerily similar to what we are seeing on the mainstream media now, that this is Trump's election, it's a red wave, decreased enthusiasm because Biden is unpopular. The same story we have been sold for the past 3 years, yet to no avail in any special election, besides the one pre-Dobbs. And even then, some of them not really. But any election post-Dobbs, any election in the midterms, any election in the 2023 off-year elections. I mean, we have seen consistently an overperformance by Democrats. And it seems very similar to what we saw in that overperformance in 2022 in the polls. And so Democrats look at this and say, this is how we win. And again, I preface this video by saying that I don't think that this can be the end-all be-all when it comes down to, polling and looking at the errors, because 2020 is as valuable as 2022. But I will say, there is certainly merit in believing that the polls in 2024 are going to be off by a similar amount as the most recent cycle than 2 years prior. One amidst a pandemic. One amidst a very, very non-traditional time for polling firms and for reputable data sources. And so when I look at 2024 and I look at the data, it's obvious. Trump leads in these battleground states. But the question is, does he actually lead in them? Of course, you look to the presidential numbers on the national level and say, there's no way. How is it that Trump leads here and yet could be losing these battleground states? But a reminder, Republicans won the national popular vote in 2022 by 3 points, lost almost every battleground state on the Senate and gubernatorial level. And so now in 2024, it is entirely possible that based on the 2022 metrics, that Biden wins the election with just simply 2022 polling errors, which is a very good thing for the Biden administration, for the Biden campaign, because it's what they need to win. They need something like this to happen, where people come out of the woodwork despite ignoring all the polling questions, telling the pollsters they're voting one way and actually voting another, and ultimately coming out on election day and saying that this is what they want for the future of America. Because that's what Democrats are relying on. It's what they need, and it could happen. It might not, though, and I think all of it comes down to the ground game, the strategy, what happens between now and November 5th, because it will determine the future not only of just the two political parties, but of this nation, and a lot is on the line. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2024 election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.